Ashworth Manor stood dignified and grey against the October morning of 1818, its windows catching the pale light like watchful eyes, and within its orderly corridors Eleanor Hartley moved as she had moved for 10 years, silently and with perfect efficiency, a shadow among shadows, her hands steady as she fastened the tiny buttons along Lady Sophia's morning dress, while the child chattered about the robin she had seen in the garden. Eleanor was 28 years old, plain in the way that invites no second glance, her brown hair always neatly pinned beneath her cap, her grey dress, the regulation uniform of a lady's maid, her face pleasant but unremarkable, the sort of face that even kindly observers would struggle to recall an hour after she left a room. She had served this household since she was 18, attending first to the late Lady Ashworth until that gracious woman had succumbed to fever 5 years past, and now to the dowager Lady Ashworth, and most particularly to young Sophia, the 8-year-old daughter of the house who at least noticed when Eleanor entered a room, who smiled at her and asked for the stories Eleanor would tell in a soft voice while mending torn hems and loose ribbons. Eleanor knew every room of this manor, every creaking floorboard and draughty corner, knew the rhythm of the household as intimately as her own heartbeat, knew when to appear and when to vanish, knew how to press a gown so it hung without a single crease, and how to dress hair so it would hold through an evening's entertainment, knew her place with the certainty of long practice and longer resignation. She had learned not to hope for more, had learned to take her satisfaction in work well done, in the small thanks offered by Lady Sophia or the Dowager, in her modest wages carefully saved in a tin box beneath her narrow bed in the servants' quarters. She had also learned not to let her gaze linger on Lord William Ashworth when he passed in the corridors or stood in the morning room reviewing correspondence, had learned to make herself even smaller and more invisible when he was near, though she could not help but observe him in those unguarded moments when her presence was so entirely unremarked that she might as well have been a piece of furniture. He was a good master, fair and just, never cruel, prompt with wages and reasonable in his expectations, a man of 35 years who carried the weight of his estates and responsibilities with steady competence, his dark hair touched with early silver, his expression serious and remote, in the way of men who have loved and lost and withdrawn into duty as a kind of armor. He spoke kindly to his daughter, consulted respectfully with his steward, nodded to his servants as a category but never as individuals, and in 10 years of service Eleanor could not recall a single moment when Lord William Ashworth had truly looked at her, truly seen her as Eleanor, as a person with a name and a heart and a life that continued when she left his presence. Eleanor had been 18 when she first arrived at Ashworth Manor in the spring of 1808, a girl still young enough to harbour the soft, undefined hopes that girls of her station were permitted, dreams that did not reach so high as to invite rebuke, but existed nonetheless in the private chambers of her heart where she imagined perhaps a kind steward might notice her, or a respectable tradesman, or even a senior servant who might offer marriage and a small household of their own where she could be a wife instead of always a servant, always secondary, always in the background of other people's lives. She had been prettier then, or at least younger, which in the economy of female value amounted to nearly the same thing, her face softer and less resigned, her eyes still bright with the possibility that life might unfold into something more than endless labor in the service of others' comfort. But 10 years had passed since that hopeful spring. 10 years of watching younger girls arrive and catch the eye of this footman or that groom. 10 years of attending weddings for others, standing in the back of the church in her good grey dress, applauding politely as girls with rosier cheeks and readier laughs stepped into futures that seemed to recede further from Eleanor with each passing season. She was 28 now, which in the servants' hall was accounted firmly on the shelf, past the age when men looked twice, past the age when even modest hopes seemed anything but foolish, and she had made her peace with it as one makes peace with any unchangeable aspect of one's condition, the way one accepts the weather or the turning of seasons, Her solace was her skill, her steadiness, the reputation she had earned for competence and discretion, and the small weekly wages that she tucked away with careful discipline into the tin box beneath her bed. Coins that accumulated so slowly, but with such constancy, that over 10 years they had become a modest sum, enough perhaps for some future she had not yet defined, but which lived in her imagination as a cottage somewhere, a garden, a life that belonged to her alone. Her one true friend in the household was Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, a woman of 50 with iron grey hair and a heart far softer than her stern countenance suggested, who had seen something in Eleanor from the beginning, some quality of steadiness and quiet dignity that commanded respect, and who had told her more than once that she was worth 10 of the flighty girls who came and went, though such assurances, kindly meant, could not change the fundamental facts of Eleanor's situation or restore the hopes that time and invisibility had slowly worn away. Lord William Ashworth woke at dawn as he had every morning for the past 5 years, since the fever had taken his wife Catherine and left him alone with a 3-year-old daughter and an estate that required constant attention. And he rose from his bed with the mechanical precision of a man whose days were ordered by duty rather than desire, washing and dressing with efficiency, descending to his study before most of the household had stirred, reviewing correspondence and account books, while the autumn sun crept slowly across the Persian carpet that Catherine had chosen in happier days. He was 35 years old, considered by the neighbourhood to be a man in his prime, tall and well-formed, his dark hair silvering at the temples in a way that ladies of quality found distinguished, his manner grave and courteous, his reputation that of a fair landlord and responsible master who managed his estates with competence and his household with distant benevolence, never cruel but never warm, a man who had withdrawn into the armour of his responsibilities and found there a kind of peace, or at least an absence of pain. His days followed an unvarying pattern: estate business in the morning, riding out to consult with tenants or inspect fields, luncheon taken often in solitude or with his steward, afternoons devoted to correspondence or meetings with his man of business, evenings with his daughter Sophia before she was taken up to bed by whomever attended her, then more work or a book in the library until he retired, and through it all the household staff moved around him like a well-trained orchestra, appearing when needed and vanishing when not, their individual faces and names a blur of interchangeable efficiency that he never thought to examine more closely. On this particular October morning, he finished his review of the quarterly accounts, satisfied that the estate was prospering under his management, and went upstairs to the nursery to see Sophia before her lessons began. Finding her already dressed in a pale blue frock, her dark curls neatly arranged, and he kissed her forehead and asked about her plans for the day, while behind his daughter, near the window, a woman in a grey dress stood quietly with her hands folded, holding a ribbon that had evidently just been tied in Sophia's hair, and William glanced in that general direction without truly seeing, his eyes passing over the servant as one might pass over a piece of furniture, noting only that someone was performing their function adequately. Sophia chatted about the robin in the garden, and asked if they might walk together later, and William promised he would try, though both of them knew his promises were often displaced by more pressing matters, and he left the nursery with a last, fond look at his daughter, never once actually focusing on the woman who had stepped back against the wall to allow him passage, never registering the quiet competence with which she had prepared his child for the day, never knowing her name or how long she had served his household, never imagining that this unremarkable moment contained a presence that would, in a fortnight's time, upend the careful order of his existence. The letter arrived on a grey morning in mid-October, delivered by the weekly post and handed to Eleanor by one of the footmen, who barely glanced at her as he passed through the servants' hall, and she recognized her aunt's spidery handwriting on the outer fold and felt a small flutter of anxiety, for Aunt Margaret wrote rarely and never without purpose, and Eleanor carried the letter up to the small room she shared with another maid and waited until she had a moment of privacy before breaking the seal. The words swam before her eyes as she read them once, Then again, scarcely able to comprehend what the solicitor's formal language conveyed. Her aunt had died peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks prior, and in her will had left to her only niece, Eleanor Hartley, the small cottage in the village of Millbrook, where she had lived for 40 years, along with its contents and a modest sum of £200 that had been carefully saved over a lifetime of frugal widowhood. And Eleanor sat very still on the edge of her narrow bed as the reality settled over her like a cloak, both heavy and weightless at once. This was freedom. This thin piece of paper with its official seals and legal phrasing. This was the independence she had dreamed of in the abstract way one dreams of things too distant to be real. And yet now that it lay tangible in her hands, she felt not triumph, but a confusion of emotions she could not immediately name. Grief for the aunt she had seen only a handful of times, but who had remembered her nonetheless. Gratitude for the gift that required nothing of her but acceptance. And beneath it all, a strange, aching sadness that surprised her with its intensity, for it meant leaving Ashworth Manor, leaving the only home she had truly known in her adult life, leaving the routines and rooms, and even the people who had never quite seen her, but who had nonetheless formed the fabric of her existence for 10 years. She sat with the letter for nearly an hour before she finally rose and smoothed her dress and went to find Mrs. Pemberton, and then together they went to Lady Ashworth, and Eleanor gave her notice with quiet courtesy, explaining the inheritance and thanking her ladyship for a decade of fair employment, and Lady Ashworth accepted the news with the mild indifference of someone losing a competent but ultimately replaceable servant, expressing perfunctory condolences and asking only that Eleanor stay long enough to train her replacement. And by evening the news had spread through the servants' hall like ripples in a pond, and Mrs. Pemberton embraced her with tears in her eyes and called her a fortunate girl, even as she mourned the loss of her steady presence. And Eleanor returned to her little room and carefully folded the letter and placed it in her tin box with her savings, and felt the future opening before her like a door into a country she had never seen. The final 2 weeks passed with a strange dreamlike quality, as though Eleanor were walking through rooms she had known intimately, but now saw from a great distance, each familiar corner and corridor taking on the soft focus of memory even before she had left, and she spent her days training her replacement, a girl named Mary, who had just turned 19, with rosy cheeks and bright eyes that sparkled when any of the footmen passed, who giggled at the slightest provocation and blushed when Lady Ashworth spoke to her, and Eleanor watched this younger version of hope and possibility with a tenderness that held no envy, only a quiet recognition of who she herself had been a decade ago, before the years had taught her the particular invisibility of being useful but unremarkable. She showed Mary how Lady Ashworth preferred her tea, which dresses required particular care, how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, and Mary listened with earnest attention, though Eleanor suspected half the instruction would be forgotten within a week, and she found she did not mind, for it was no longer her concern, and that realization brought a relief so profound it was almost painful. She said her private goodbyes to the places that had shaped her days, the little alcove near the nursery where she had sat countless times, mending clothes while Sophia played, the window on the second-floor landing that looked out over the gardens, where she had watched the seasons turn 10 times over, the servants' hall where she had eaten 1,000 meals in companionable silence, and with each farewell she felt the threads that bound her to this place loosening one by one. On the Thursday of her final week, she allowed herself something she had never permitted before, a moment of pure self-indulgence that she knew was dangerous but could not resist now that she was leaving and therefore safe from the consequences of her own heart. She paused outside the study where Lord Ashworth sat at his desk reviewing correspondence, the door slightly ajar, and she simply looked at him, memorizing the line of his shoulders, the way the afternoon light caught in his hair, the focused expression he wore when he was absorbed in his work, and she let herself acknowledge for the first time the feeling she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it did not exist, the quiet, hopeless tenderness she had carried for this man who had never once truly seen her, who would never know that for years she had loved him in the safe silence of her own hidden heart. And she stood there for perhaps 2 minutes, granting herself this single indulgence, this moment of honest feeling, before she turned away and continued down the hall to fold Lady Ashworth's shawls and pack them in lavender, carrying her secret with her like a pressed flower in a book, beautiful and bloodless and safely dead. Sophia discovered that Eleanor was leaving on the Friday before her departure, when the child came bounding into her grandmother's sitting room to show a ribbon she had found, and overheard Lady Ashworth instructing the new maid Mary on the proper way to arrange her jewellery box, and the little girl had stopped mid-step and asked where Eleanor had gone, and Lady Ashworth had explained with casual indifference that Eleanor would be leaving service at the end of the week, and Sophia had gone very still, in that way children do when they are absorbing news too large to immediately comprehend, and then she had turned and run through the corridors until she found Eleanor in the linen room folding sheets, and she had thrown herself at Eleanor's skirts with a ferocity that nearly knocked the older woman backward, crying that it was not true, that Eleanor could not leave, that she would not allow it. Eleanor had knelt down and gathered the child into her arms, feeling her heart crack at the tears soaking into her shoulder, and she had stroked Sophia's dark curls and murmured gentle reassurances that meant nothing, for the truth remained unchanged, and Sophia had pulled back and looked at her with those large grey eyes so like her father's, and demanded to know why. Why was she leaving? Did she not love Sophia any more? And Eleanor had felt tears prick her own eyes as she promised that she loved her very much, but that she had to go and build her own life now, and Sophia had declared with the absolute conviction of an 8-year-old that she would make Papa fix it, that Papa could do anything, that he would make Eleanor stay. That evening at supper, which Eleanor knew of only because Mrs. Pemberton recounted it to her later with a mixture of sympathy and concern, Sophia had refused to eat, and had begged her father with increasing desperation to make Eleanor stay, to offer her more wages, to command her not to leave, and Lord Ashworth had looked up from his soup with mild surprise, and asked who Eleanor was, and Sophia had stared at him with disbelief, and cried that Eleanor was her maid, that she had been with them forever, that she told the best stories and mended all her dolls and braided her hair every morning, and was the kindest person in the whole house, and William had frowned slightly as though searching his memory for a face to attach to the name, and then he had said with the gentle dismissiveness of a parent humouring a child's excessive attachment that servants came and went, that it was the way of things, that Sophia would grow fond of the new maid in time, and the little girl had burst into fresh sobs and fled from the dining-room, leaving her father bewildered, and Lady Ashworth shaking her head at the dramatics of children. Eleanor had been passing through the hallway adjacent to the dining-room when this conversation occurred, carrying a stack of linens to the upstairs cupboard, and she had heard every word through the partially open door, and she had stood there in the shadows holding her linens and felt the final thread of foolish hope she had not even known she still carried simply dissolve, for his words had crystallized everything she had always known, but had perhaps not fully accepted until this moment. She was not merely invisible to Lord Ashworth, but essentially interchangeable, a skiam, function rather than a person, as replaceable as a worn pair of gloves, and the quiet ache she had harboured became something cleaner and sharper, a resolve that carried no bitterness but only clarity, and she had continued up the stairs with steady steps, more certain than ever that leaving was not just wise, but necessary. The departure day arrived with the particular quality of autumn mornings in late October, when the air holds a crystalline coldness that makes every sound sharper and every colour more vivid, and Eleanor woke in the small attic room she had occupied for 10 years, feeling as though she were moving through a dream, her modest trunk already packed and waiting by the door, her few possessions arranged with the same careful efficiency she had brought to every task in this household. She dressed in her best grey wool dress, the one she had made herself 2 years prior with fabric purchased from her savings, and she pinned her light brown hair with particular care, and she looked around the bare room one final time before descending the servants' stairs for the last time, her footsteps echoing in the early morning silence. The other servants had gathered in the courtyard despite the early hour, for Eleanor had been well liked, even if she had never been particularly noticed, and Mrs. Pemberton stood at the centre of the group with red-rimmed eyes. And when Eleanor emerged into the cool morning air, the housekeeper stepped forward and embraced her with a fierceness that spoke of affection too deep for words, whispering that she was to right, that she was to be happy, that she deserved every good thing. The stable boy had loaded her trunk onto the hired carriage that waited near the kitchen entrance, a modest conveyance that would carry her 20 miles to the village where her new life awaited, and Eleanor was making her quiet farewells to the cook and the parlour-maid when there came a sudden commotion from the house, and Sophia appeared running across the courtyard in her white nightgown, her dark hair loose down her back, her face streaked with tears, and she flung herself at Eleanor with such force that Eleanor staggered backward and had to brace herself to catch the child. Sophia was sobbing that she could not go, that she must not go, that nothing would be right without her, and Eleanor knelt in the damp courtyard and held the little girl and stroked her hair and murmured soothing words that meant nothing, because the truth remained that she was leaving. And over Sophia's shaking shoulders, Eleanor saw Lord Ashworth emerge from the house, clearly drawn by his daughter's cries, and he stood at the top of the steps looking down at the scene with an expression Eleanor could not read. He descended slowly, his intent clearly to simply acknowledge her departure with a nod and then shepherd his daughter back inside. But when he reached the courtyard, something made him pause, and for the first time in 10 years, William Ashworth truly looked at Eleanor Hartley, saw the way she held his daughter with infinite gentleness, saw the respect in the faces of the servants gathered around her, saw the quiet dignity in her posture even as she knelt on the cold stones, and something in his chest shifted in a way he did not understand. Eleanor gently disentangled herself from Sophia's embrace and rose to her feet, smoothing her grey wool skirt with hands that trembled only slightly, and she turned to face Lord Ashworth fully, for what she realized might be the first and last time in all these years, and she executed a perfect curtsy, the kind she had practiced 1,000 times in service, but had never before performed with such acute awareness of the man before whom she bent. When she rose, she lifted her eyes and met his gaze directly, and in that moment something passed between them that neither could have named, a recognition or a question, or perhaps simply the shock of truly seeing another human being after years of looking past them, and Eleanor found that his eyes were not the distant grey she had observed from afar, but held flecks of blue and green like a winter sea. And William found himself startled by the intelligence and depth in her face, by the quiet strength in her bearing, by the realization that this woman had been in his home for 10 years, and he had never once truly looked at her. Eleanor's voice when she spoke was soft and clear, carrying across the courtyard with a grace that matched her movements, and she said, "Thank you, Lord Ashworth, for 10 years of fair and just employment, for maintaining a household in which I have been safe and treated with respect, and I wish you and Lady Sophia every happiness." Her words held no bitterness, no accusation, no plea for acknowledgement of the oversight that had defined their non-relationship, only a simple, genuine gratitude that somehow made William feel more ashamed than any reproach could have accomplished. She held his gaze for one moment longer, and then she smiled, a small, sad smile that transformed her plain features into something almost luminous, and she whispered, "Goodbye," the word so soft it was nearly lost in the autumn air, and she turned away from him with a finality that felt like a door closing. William stood frozen as Eleanor moved to the carriage, as the driver handed her up into the modest conveyance, as she settled herself on the worn seat and arranged her skirts with the same careful efficiency she had surely brought to every task in his household, and Sophia was crying again, and Mrs. Pemberton was dabbing at her eyes, and the other servants were waving and calling out farewells, but William could not move, could not speak, could only stand there as the driver climbed to his seat and took up the reins. The carriage lurched into motion, wheels crunching on gravel, and Eleanor did not look back. Her face turned resolutely forward toward whatever future awaited her in that distant village. And William felt something he had not felt in 5 years, not since his wife's death had left him numb and hollowed. He felt a sharp, immediate sense of loss, a conviction that something precious was slipping through his fingers, and he did not understand it, because how could he lose what he had never known he had? William returned to the house with Sophia's hand clasped in his own, the child still trembling with sobs that shook her thin shoulders, and he lifted her into his arms, though she was perhaps growing too old for such carrying, and he felt the wetness of her tears soaking into his collar as he climbed the stairs to the nursery, where her new governess waited with a disapproving expression at the disruption to the morning routine. He settled Sophia in the window seat of her room, the same spot where Eleanor must have sat with her countless times, and he knelt before his daughter and tried to summon the words that would comfort her, but found he had none because he did not truly understand the depth of her distress. "Why did Miss Hartley matter so much to you?" he asked gently, wiping at her tear-stained cheeks with his thumb. And Sophia looked at him with eyes that held accusation and disbelief that he needed to ask. "She told me stories, Papa," Sophia said, her voice breaking on the words. Stories about brave girls and kind animals and places where magic was real. And she mended my dolls when their arms came loose, and she never scolded me for being careless. And she braided my hair in the mornings and sang while she did it, and she told me I was clever when I read a hard passage, and she said I would grow up to be strong and good. The litany continued, each item a small kindness that William had never known about, had never witnessed, had never thought to notice. And with each revelation he felt his ignorance settle more heavily upon him like a weight he could not shift. He coaxed Sophia to take some breakfast, though she only picked at the toast, and then he left her in the governess's care and descended to his study, where he intended to attend to correspondence, but found himself staring at the papers without seeing them. He rang for Mrs. Pemberton, and when the housekeeper arrived he asked her to sit, an informality that made her eyebrows rise, and he asked her about Eleanor Hartley, about what manner of person she had been, about why the entire household seemed to mourn her departure. Mrs. Pemberton regarded him with an expression that held both respect for his position and a certain protective reserve. And then she told him that Eleanor had been the steadiest and most capable worker she had known in 30 years of service, that she never complained, never shirked, never caused trouble, that she was kind to everyone from the lowest scullery maid to Lady Ashworth herself, and that the household had run more smoothly because of her quiet competence. "She has been here 10 years, William said, the number feeling suddenly significant and shameful, and Mrs. Pemberton nodded and said, "Yes, my lord, 10 years, and in all that time she never once asked for special consideration or drew attention to herself. And that is why I suppose she was so easy to overlook, though it was a great disservice that she was overlooked nonetheless." William dismissed Mrs. Pemberton with quiet thanks and sat alone in his study as the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted in the stillness, and he found himself unable to focus on the estate ledgers that lay open before him or the correspondence that required his attention. He rose and walked through the house with no particular destination, moving through rooms that had been his domain for years, and everywhere he looked he began to see spaces where Eleanor Hartley must have been, corners and thresholds and passages that she must have occupied daily while he moved past her unseeing. He climbed the stairs to Sophia's nursery and stood in the doorway looking at the window seat with its faded cushions, imagining Eleanor sitting there with his daughter curled against her side, telling stories in that soft, clear voice he had heard fully for the first time only that morning. He saw the shelf where Sophia's dolls sat in a neat row, their clothes carefully mended, their tiny limbs properly attached, and he realized that Eleanor's hands had done that work, that her patience and skill had brought his daughter comfort in ways he had never known to acknowledge. In the hallway outside the drawing room, he paused, remembering now a figure he had passed countless times, a woman in grey who had stepped aside to let him pass, who had curtsied and kept her eyes lowered, and he felt a creeping shame at how thoroughly he had failed to see her. He returned to his chambers and opened the drawer where he kept his handkerchiefs, and he drew one out and examined it in the fading light, seeing for the first time the exquisite stitching along the hem, the monogram of his initials worked in thread so fine it must have taken hours to complete. He had used this handkerchief a dozen times, had taken its perfection for granted, had never once asked who had mended it or thanked the person whose labor had restored it. He stood there holding the square of linen and felt the weight of his blindness settle upon him like a physical thing, and he understood that Eleanor Hartley had given 10 years of her life to his household, had performed 1,000 unseen kindnesses, had made his home function smoothly, and his daughter feel loved, and he had never once acknowledged her existence as a person rather than a function. Evening came, and he did not dress for dinner, taking a tray in his study instead, and he sat by the fire as darkness filled the windows and found himself profoundly restless, unable to settle into any activity or thought that did not circle back to the woman who had whispered goodbye that morning. He tried to recall her face as it had been in that moment when she met his eyes, tried to capture the expression he had seen there, the dignity and sadness and quiet strength, and he realized he was already forgetting the details because he had never properly learned them in the first place. William woke before dawn with a restlessness thrumming through his limbs that made further sleep impossible, and he rose and dressed himself without calling for his valet, pulling on riding clothes with hands that felt clumsy and urgent. He moved through the silent house as grey light began to seep through the windows, past the closed doors of bedchambers where his household still slept, and he descended to the stables where the grooms were just beginning their morning routines and startled at his early appearance. He ordered his horse prepared, his best gelding, the one with stamina for a long ride. And while the animal was being saddled, he told the confused stablemaster that he would be gone for the day, and to inform his steward that estate business would have to wait. He swung into the saddle as the sun broke over the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the gravel drive, and he urged the horse forward with a pressure of his knees, moving from a trot to a canter as he passed through the manor gates and onto the road that led toward the village where Eleanor Hartley had gone. He told himself as he rode that this was simply a matter of duty, that as her former employer he bore some responsibility for ensuring she had arrived safely at her inheritance, that it was only proper to confirm she had adequate resource and was not in need of assistance. But even as he formed these justifications in his mind, he knew they were thin coverings for something else, something he could not yet name, an urgency that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the way her voice had sounded when she whispered goodbye, the look in her eyes when they met his for that single unguarded moment. The countryside rolled past him in shades of gold and amber, autumn at its peak, the hedgerows thick with berries and the fields lying fallow after harvest, and he pushed the horse faster than was perhaps wise on the rutted roads, driven by a need he did not fully understand. His thoughts churned as the miles passed beneath him, circling around the revelations of the previous day, the litany of kindnesses Sophia had recounted, Mrs. Pemberton's quiet testimony to Eleanor's worth, the handkerchief with its perfect stitching that represented just one of countless unseen labors. He thought about the woman who had lived in his house for 10 years, who had moved through his days like a ghost, and he felt shame settle deep in his chest at how thoroughly he had failed to see her, how completely he had taken her presence for granted. The sun climbed higher as he rode, warming the air, and he began to wonder what he would say when he reached her cottage, how he would explain this impulsive journey, what words he could possibly offer that would make sense of the compulsion that had driven him from his bed before dawn to chase after a woman he had never truly known. William arrived at the village just past midday when the autumn sun stood high and bright, and he slowed his horse to a walk as he passed the small shops and cottages that lined the main street, asking directions from a woman sweeping her doorstep, who pointed him toward a lane that curved away from the center of the village toward a stand of oak trees already half bare of leaves. He found the cottage easily, a small stone structure with a thatched roof and a garden gate that hung slightly crooked on its hinges, and he dismounted and tied his horse to the post before pausing to look at the place that Eleanor Hartley had inherited, seeing how neat it was despite its modest size, how the garden beds were carefully tended even this late in the season, how smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady stream. He approached the window and looked through the wavy glass, and there she was, moving about the small front room with her back to him, arranging books on a shelf, and he was struck by how different she appeared in this space that was entirely her own. At the manor she had always held herself with a particular stillness, a way of occupying minimal space, of making herself small and unobtrusive. But here in her cottage she moved with a fluidity he had never seen. Her shoulders relaxed, her gestures unhurried, and there was something in her expression when she turned toward the light that made him catch his breath, a softness and openness that transformed her features entirely. He realized he was staring, and stepped back from the window, suddenly uncertain of what he was doing here, what he could possibly say to explain his presence. But he had ridden for hours, and could not simply turn back without speaking to her, so he moved to the door and knocked, hearing the sound echo in the quiet afternoon. There was a pause, then footsteps, and the door opened, and Eleanor stood before him with her hand still on the latch, her eyes widening in shock and confusion as she recognized him, and he saw her glance past him as if expecting to see others. A carriage, some delegation. Before her gaze returned to his face with an expression of such bewilderment that he felt foolish and intrusive. She curtsied automatically, a gesture so ingrained that she performed it even here in her own doorway, and she said his name with a question in her voice. "Lord Ashworth, is something wrong? Is Sophia well?" And he realized she could conceive of no reason for his appearance except some crisis or catastrophe. He removed his hat and asked if he might speak with her, hearing the formality in his own voice, and Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before stepping back and opening the door wider, gesturing him into her small parlor with a hand that trembled slightly, her face flushed with confusion and what might have been fear. Eleanor gestured toward the single chair near the fireplace, where a modest fire crackled against the afternoon chill, and William sat, because standing seemed to increase the awkwardness between them, and she remained standing for a moment before perching on the edge of a small wooden stool, her hands folded in her lap in that familiar attitude of patient waiting. He now recognized as the posture she had held throughout all those years at the manor. He cleared his throat and asked if she was well, if the journey had been difficult, if the cottage was in good repair, hearing his own voice take on the formal cadence he used when inspecting the estate or addressing tenants about their concerns. And Eleanor answered each question with quiet assurance, telling him the journey had been uneventful. The cottage was small but sound. She had everything she required. She thanked him again for the years of fair employment, for wages paid promptly, for a household run with justice and order, and her gratitude was so genuine and so complete that it made him feel worse rather than better, made him aware of how little he had actually given her beyond the basic requirements of a decent employer. A silence fell between them, awkward and heavy, and William looked around the small room, seeing her few possessions arranged with care, a stack of books on the shelf, a sewing basket beside the hearth, a vase with late autumn branches on the small table, and he realized he had no legitimate reason to be sitting in her parlor, no excuse that would withstand examination for why he had ridden for hours to see a woman who had been his employee and was now simply a free person living her own life. He should rise, make his departure, return to his own world and leave her to hers, but instead he found himself asking a question that came from somewhere deeper than courtesy or duty, asking why she had left, why she had chosen to go when she might have remained in security and comfort at the manor. Eleanor looked at him with surprise evident in her wide eyes, and she seemed to be measuring whether he truly wanted an answer or was merely making conversation. And after a long moment, she said carefully that she had been grateful for her position, that she had learned much and been treated fairly, but that 10 years was a long time to live in one place, and she had felt it was time for a change. Her answer was diplomatic and bland, the kind of response a servant gives to deflect deeper inquiry, and William recognized it as such and felt frustration rise in his chest because he had not ridden all this way for pleasantries and evasions, and he leaned forward and said with more intensity than he intended that he truly wished to know, that he was asking in earnest, why had she really left? Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her hands still folded in her lap, and he could see her weighing something behind her eyes, some decision about whether to offer him truth or continue with the safe evasions that had protected her throughout her years of service. And then something in her expression shifted, and she straightened slightly on her stool and spoke with a quiet honesty that held no bitterness, but only a kind of weary clarity. She told him that she had served his household for 10 years, that she had taken pride in her work and had been grateful for fair treatment and wages paid on time, that she held no resentment toward him or his family, but that somewhere in those 10 years she had realized she had become invisible, not only to the family she served, but gradually to herself as well. She said that she would pass through rooms and hallways and no one would turn their head, that she could stand at the edge of a conversation and remain entirely unacknowledged, that she had learned to move through the manor like a ghost who performed tasks, but left no impression of having been present, and that this invisibility had become so complete that she had begun to forget she was a person who might be seen. Her voice remained steady as she spoke, and William sat frozen in his chair, each word landing on him with the weight of accusation, though she offered none, only simple truth delivered without rancor. She told him that when the letter came about her aunt's cottage, she had recognized it as a chance to live in a place where she might be visible, even if only to herself, where she might look in a mirror and remember that she existed as more than a set of hands that mended and arranged and served. She said that she wanted to walk down a street and have someone nod to her in recognition, to tend a garden that was her own, to sit by a fire in the evening and know that the space she occupied mattered because it was hers and she had chosen it. She told him that leaving had not been an act of rebellion or dissatisfaction with her position, but simply a choice to become real again, to step out of the shadows and into a life where she could be seen. And as she finished speaking, she met his eyes with a dignity that was almost unbearable in its quiet strength, waiting for whatever response he might offer to this confession of a decade of erasure that he had never noticed, and she had endured without complaint. William sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of her words settling over him like heavy snow accumulating on frozen ground, and he understood with sudden and terrible clarity that he had inflicted this invisibility upon her through nothing more than his own blindness, his own comfortable assumption that the people who served him were simply functions rather than souls with their own interior landscapes and longings. He looked at Eleanor sitting on her modest stool in this small cottage that represented her bid for existence, and he felt shame burn through him, not the polite embarrassment of a social misstep, but something deeper and more painful, the recognition of a moral failure he had not known he was committing. He wanted to apologize, but the words seemed inadequate, wanted to defend himself, but there was no defense, and so instead he found himself leaning forward in his chair and asking, with a humility that felt unfamiliar on his tongue, if she would tell him about herself, truly about herself, the things he should have known and never asked. Eleanor looked startled by the question, her hands tightening briefly in her lap, and he could see her weighing whether this was genuine interest or merely aristocratic politeness, but something in his expression must have convinced her, because after a moment she began to speak, haltingly at first, and then with growing ease. She told him about her childhood in a small village, much like this one, the daughter of a schoolmaster who had taught her to read and write, and to love books despite their modest circumstances, and about her mother who had been skilled with a needle and had passed that gift to her daughter, along with a love of creating beauty from simple materials. She spoke of her father's death when she was 16, her mother's illness that followed, and the necessity that had led her to service at 18, carrying with her the education and skills that set her apart from many in her position, but also made her isolation more acute, because she could see and understand the distance between what she was and what she might have been in different circumstances. William listened with an attention he had rarely given to anyone, hearing not just the facts of her history, but the quiet intelligence in how she spoke, the grace with which she described hardship without self-pity, the dignity she maintained even in recounting her descent from a schoolmaster's daughter to a lady's maid whose existence was noted only when she failed in some task. She told him about the books she had managed to read over the years, borrowed from the manor's library when no one was looking, and about the small dreams she had nurtured in the privacy of her own thoughts, dreams of a garden she might tend, and a window where she might sit to read without needing permission. And as she spoke, William found himself not just listening, but truly seeing her, recognizing the depth and richness of the person who had moved through his house like a ghost for 10 years, while he had looked through her as though she were made of air. The afternoon light had shifted toward evening by the time William finally rose from his chair, and Eleanor stood as well, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly from the vulnerability of having spoken so openly to a man who until yesterday had barely known her name. William moved toward the door of the small parlor, but paused with his hand on the frame, turning back to look at her with an expression that held something she could not quite read, a mixture of shame and wonder, and something else that made her heart beat faster despite her efforts to remain composed. He asked, his voice low and uncertain in a way she had never heard from him before, if he might call on her. Again, and Eleanor felt the question land on her like a physical weight, confusion flooding through her because she could not imagine what purpose such a visit would serve. She reminded him, keeping her tone gentle but firm, that he was a lord and she was a former servant, that whatever kindness had prompted his visit today had been more than generous, but surely there could be no reason for him to return, no proper basis for continued acquaintance between two people whose stations were so vastly different. William looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him struggling with something, some internal deliberation that played across his features before he spoke again. He told her that he would like to know her better, if she would permit it, that their conversation today had been the most genuine exchange he could remember having in years, and that he found himself unwilling to let it be the last. Eleanor felt her protective instincts rise, the habits of self-preservation that had kept her heart safe through 10 years of invisibility, and she asked him directly why a man of his position would wish to know a woman of hers, what he hoped to gain from such an unlikely friendship. William was quiet, and she could see him weighing his words with unusual care before he answered with a honesty that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. He said he could not quite explain it himself, that he only knew he had been moving through his life as though under water for 5 years, ever since his wife died, performing his duties and caring for his daughter, but feeling nothing deeply, seeing nothing clearly, and that somehow in the space of this single afternoon spent listening to her speak, he had felt something shift, as though he had surfaced suddenly and drawn his first real breath in years. He told her he felt he had been asleep and had just woken, and while he could not explain what that meant or what he was asking for, he knew only that he was asking, that he wanted the chance to continue what had begun today in this small cottage parlor. Eleanor stood very still, her heart hammering against her ribs, torn between the dangerous hope that wanted to say yes and the protective fear that urged her to send him away before either of them could be hurt by the impossibility of what he seemed to be suggesting. She looked at his face, saw genuine uncertainty there, genuine hope, and found herself nodding slowly, agreeing to one more visit, though she told herself even as she spoke that one more would have to be the last, that she could not allow this to become something that would break her heart all over again. William rode back toward Ashworth Manor through the gathering dusk, the November air sharp against his face, and the rhythm of his horse's hooves doing nothing to quiet the tumult of thoughts that churned through his mind with an insistence he could not dismiss or control. He had gone to Eleanor's cottage with no clear purpose beyond some vague notion of ensuring her well-being, but he was returning with something far more disturbing, a sense that the careful structure of his life had developed a crack, and through that crack he could see possibilities he had not imagined existed for him anymore. The conversation in her small parlour played itself over and over in his memory, not just the words, but the quality of the exchange, the way she had listened and responded with an intelligence and thoughtfulness that he realized he had been starved for without knowing it. He thought of the years since Catherine's death, the way he had folded himself into duty and routine, caring for Sophia and managing the estate with competence, but without joy, moving through each day as though it were a task to be completed rather than a life to be lived. Eleanor had said he looked as though he had been asleep, and the observation had struck him with the force of truth, because that was exactly how it felt, as though he had been walking through his existence in a kind of waking sleep, and had only just opened his eyes to discover that the world contained more than he had allowed himself to see. He arrived at the manor as full darkness fell, handed his horse to a groom who looked at him with barely concealed curiosity, and walked into the house where Sophia came running to ask where he had been all day. He told her he had ridden out to check on Miss Hartley, and his daughter's face lit with such hope that he felt his heart twist, because she asked immediately if Eleanor was well, and if she might come back, and he had to tell her gently that no, Eleanor would not be returning to the manor, though even as he said it, he found himself wondering if that was entirely true. The next 3 days passed with agonizing slowness, each hour dragging as William tried to focus on his responsibilities, but found his thoughts returning again and again to the woman in the cottage, to the curve of her neck when she bent her head while speaking, to the way her hands had moved expressively as she described her childhood, to the quiet dignity with which she inhabited her small space and her modest dreams. He told himself he was being foolish, that his interest was merely the result of 5 years of isolation and the novelty of genuine conversation. But he knew even as he formed the excuse that it was inadequate to explain the restlessness that drove him from room to room and made sleep elusive. On the morning of the 4th day, he went to his library and selected a volume he had read years ago and loved, a collection of poetry he thought Eleanor might enjoy, based on what she had told him of her tastes, and he rode back to her cottage with the book wrapped carefully in cloth and his heart beating harder than such a simple errand warranted. Eleanor saw him approach from her kitchen window where she had been washing the breakfast dishes, and her heart gave a startled leap when she recognized Lord Ashworth riding up the narrow lane toward her cottage, on the 4th day after his first visit, earlier than she had dared expect, and carrying something wrapped in cloth that he handled with careful attention. She dried her hands quickly and smoothed her hair, chiding herself for the nervous flutter in her stomach as she went to the door, opening it just as he dismounted and secured his horse to the post she had not yet properly repaired. He greeted her with less awkwardness than their previous meeting, his expression warm and slightly uncertain as he asked if he might come in, and she stepped aside to admit him into the small parlour that suddenly felt even smaller with his presence filling it. William unwrapped the cloth to reveal a volume of poetry, explaining that he had thought of their conversation about her love of reading, and remembered this book from his own library, wondering if she might enjoy it, and Eleanor took it from him with hands that trembled slightly as she read the spine, and recognized a collection she had longed to read, but never had the means to acquire. She thanked him with genuine feeling, touched not just by the gift itself, but by the fact that he had listened closely enough to remember what she had told him and cared enough to act upon that knowledge. She prepared tea while he settled into the chair by the window, and when she joined him, the conversation began more easily than before, the initial strangeness giving way to something that felt almost natural as they spoke of books and authors they both admired. William asked about her plans for the cottage and the small garden plot behind it, and Eleanor found herself describing her hopes with more enthusiasm than she had intended, telling him she thought she might take in mending and sewing work from the village, that she had always been skilled with a needle and might build a modest trade, and that she wanted to plant vegetables in the spring to reduce her need to purchase food at market. He listened with an attention that made her feel as though her small dreams mattered, as though the vision of her modest, independent life was something worthy of respect rather than pity. And he told her he admired her courage in building something entirely her own after so many years of service to others. They talked until the afternoon light began to slant golden through the window, and Eleanor realized with surprise that hours had passed in what felt like mere minutes, that the constraint she had felt during his first visit had dissolved into something warmer and more comfortable. When William finally rose to leave, he paused at the door and asked, with a diffidence that seemed almost boyish, if he might call again the following week, and Eleanor felt her careful guardedness waver as she agreed, watching him ride away before returning to her cottage, where she sat with the book of poetry in her lap and allowed herself, for the first time since leaving Ashworth Manor, to wonder if perhaps something impossible might be struggling toward possibility. William's visits became as regular as the turning of the seasons, beginning with that second call when he brought the book of poetry and extending through the weeks that followed as autumn deepened into the first cold breath of winter. He came once a week at first, always in the afternoon when the light slanted golden through Eleanor's small windows, and then twice weekly as November gave way to December and the bare trees stood stark against grey skies. He brought books each time, volumes from his library that he thought she might enjoy, and they would sit in her parlour with tea growing cold between them as they discussed literature and ideas with an ease that surprised them both. Eleanor discovered that beneath William's reserved exterior and his lordly manner there lived a man of genuine curiosity and thoughtfulness, someone who had read widely and thought deeply about what he read, who asked her opinions as though they mattered and listened to her answers with an attention that made her feel as though her thoughts had weight and value. William discovered that Eleanor possessed not just intelligence but wit, a quiet humour that emerged when she felt safe enough to let it show, and a perceptiveness about human nature that came from years of observation from the margins of other people's lives. They spoke of novels and poetry, of philosophy and history, of the small details of daily life, and the larger questions that haunted thoughtful people in the quiet hours. The formality that had marked their early conversations gradually softened into something warmer, the careful distance between them narrowing by degrees as Lord Ashworth became William in her thoughts, though never yet on her lips, and Miss Hartley became Eleanor in his mind, though he still addressed her with proper respect. The attraction that grew between them was unspoken but unmistakable, present in the way his eyes followed her movements as she poured tea, in the way her breath caught slightly when he leaned forward to make a point, in the lengthening silences that fell between them, that were not awkward, but charged with awareness. Yet neither gave voice to what they were beginning to feel because the gulf in their stations remained vast and unbridgeable in the eyes of the world, and both knew that to acknowledge the pull between them would be to confront an impossibility that might shatter the fragile companionship they had built. Snow began to fall in early December, dusting the village and Eleanor's garden with white, and still William came, riding through cold and weather to sit in her small cottage and talk as though there were nowhere else he would rather be, and nothing more important than the conversation they were having. Eleanor told herself she should put a stop to it, that she was storing up heartbreak with every visit, but she found she could not turn him away, could not refuse herself these hours of being truly seen and heard after so many years of invisibility. The gossip reached Ashworth Manor like frost creeping across a window pane, slow and inevitable and impossible to ignore, spreading through the servants' hall and up the back stairs until it found its way to the ears of the Dowager Lady Ashworth, William's mother, who had moved to the dower house after her son's marriage, but still maintained a keen interest in the affairs of the estate and the family reputation. She arrived at the manor on a cold December afternoon when the sky hung low and grey. Her carriage pulling up to the front entrance with a purposefulness that made the footman exchange worried glances, and she swept into William's study without waiting to be announced, her expression thunderous beneath her widow's cap. William looked up from the estate ledgers he had been reviewing with only half his attention, his mind drifting, as it so often did these days, to Eleanor's cottage and the conversation they had shared just the day before, and he saw immediately from his mother's face that something had provoked her considerable displeasure. She wasted no time on pleasantries, demanding to know if the rumours she had heard were true, if he had indeed been visiting his former maid with a frequency that had set tongues wagging from the village to the county seat, and William felt a flicker of annoyance at the invasion of his privacy, even as he acknowledged that he had known this confrontation was inevitable. He confirmed that, yes, he had been calling on Miss Hartley, that she was a woman of intelligence and character whom he had come to value, and his mother's face went rigid with a fury, barely contained by breeding and propriety, as she asked if he meant to ruin the girl's reputation or make a complete fool of himself, and drag the family name through scandal. William set down his pen with deliberate care and told his mother, with a calm that surprised him even as he spoke the words, that he had come to care for Eleanor deeply, that he found in her company a peace and a joy he had not known since his wife's death, and had thought never to feel again. The silence that followed was terrible, his mother staring at him as though he had announced his intention to take holy orders or sail for the Americas, and then she began to speak of duty and station and appropriate matches, of the 20 eligible young ladies of good family who would be honoured by his attention, of what society would say if a peer of the realm married a servant, of the damage to Sophia's prospects and the family's standing. William listened without interrupting, but when she finished, he told her quietly that his mind was not yet fully decided, but his heart knew its own inclination, and that he would not be moved by considerations of station when it came to matters of genuine feeling and connection, and his mother left in a rustle of silk and outrage that echoed through the manor long after her carriage had disappeared down the drive. Eleanor heard the gossip on a grey December afternoon when she walked to the village market for thread and tea, her basket over her arm and her head bent against the cold wind that swept down from the hills and rattled the bare branches overhead. The whispers began at the baker's shop, where 2 women fell silent when she entered, and then resumed their conversation in pointed undertones once she had moved to examine the loaves, and continued at the butcher's stall, where the proprietor's wife gave her a look that mingled curiosity with something that might have been pity or disapproval, and reached their crescendo at the draper's, where Mrs. Collins, who had always been friendly, leaned across the counter and asked in a voice edged with false concern whether Eleanor was quite comfortable with all the attention she had been receiving from certain grand personages. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks even as her hands went cold, understanding immediately what was being said and left unsaid, knowing that William's visits had been noted and remarked upon and dissected by every tongue in the village and likely beyond. She walked home with her purchases clutched tight, and her heart a confusion of emotions she could scarcely name, thrilled that William's attention had been public enough to provoke comment, because surely that must mean something, that he was not ashamed to be seen calling on her, and yet terrified by what the gossip implied, and what it might cost both of them if it continued. She knew that whispers could ruin a woman of her station more thoroughly than any action. That speculation about impropriety was nearly as damaging as impropriety itself, and she also knew with a clarity that made her stomach tighten that William's visits could mean something or they could mean nothing, that a lord's interest in a former servant's conversation might be mere curiosity or kindness with no deeper intention. And if she allowed herself to hope for more, she risked a heartbreak that would shatter her utterly. Mrs. Pemberton arrived at the cottage 2 days later, having made the journey from the manor with the express purpose of speaking plainly to the girl she had mentored and protected for 10 years. And over tea in Eleanor's small parlour, she delivered her warning with the gentle firmness of someone who cared too much to stay silent. She told Eleanor that she had heard the talk, that the whole county was buzzing with speculation about Lord Ashworth and his former maid, and that while she believed William to be an honourable man, Eleanor must understand that hope could be a dangerous thing for women of their class, that lords did not marry servants no matter how much they might value their company, and that Eleanor was storing up a grief that might break her if she did not guard her heart more carefully. Eleanor listened and nodded and thanked her old friend for the concern, and when Mrs. Pemberton left, she sat alone in the gathering dusk and acknowledged the truth of every word, but she knew with absolute certainty that she could not turn William away when he came to her door, could not refuse herself these hours of being seen and known, even if the price she paid later was devastating. William arrived at Eleanor's cottage on a December afternoon when snow had begun to fall in earnest, the flakes descending thick and silent from a sky the colour of pewter, and he knocked at her door with a strange tightness in his chest that he recognized as both anticipation and a fear he could not quite name. Eleanor opened the door, and the surprise in her eyes gave way to something more complicated when she saw his expression, and she stepped aside without a word to let him enter, brushing the snow from his shoulders with an instinctive gesture that spoke of care, even as her face remained guarded. They sat in her small parlour with tea growing cold between them and the fire crackling in the grate, and for several long moments neither spoke, the weight of all that had been left unsaid in their previous visits pressing down upon the silence until William could no longer bear it. He told her, his voice rougher than he intended, that he had been only half alive since Catherine died, that he had wrapped himself in duty and routine and emotional distance because feeling anything at all had been too painful, that he had thought himself resigned to a life of mere function without joy or genuine connection. He said that knowing her these past weeks had awakened something in him he had believed permanently extinguished, that their conversations had become the fixed point around which his days organized themselves, that he found himself thinking of things she might say or how she might laugh at some observation, and that he had come to realize he was no longer half alive when he sat in her small cottage with the world reduced to just the two of them and the quiet communion they had built. Eleanor listened with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face very pale, and when he finished she drew a breath that sounded unsteady and told him that she valued his friendship more than she could express, that these weeks had been a gift beyond measure, but that she understood the limits of what was possible between them, the boundaries that could not be crossed, no matter how much either of them might wish otherwise. William leaned forward and asked her what limits she meant, what boundaries, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made Eleanor's heart beat so hard she was certain he must hear it. She felt herself balanced on the edge of something vast and terrifying, the choice between protecting herself and speaking a truth that might shatter everything, and when she opened her mouth, she was not entirely certain which path she would choose until the words began to emerge, quiet and careful, and weighted with all the longing she had tried so desperately to suppress. Eleanor spoke with a steadiness that surprised her, given how wildly her heart was racing, and she told William that she needed him to understand what he was asking when he spoke of limits and boundaries, that she was a former servant and he was a lord, that the world in which they lived did not permit such unions, no matter how much two people might value one another's company or find joy in conversation. She said that she would not be his secret, would not accept clandestine visits that grew more frequent and more intimate until the inevitable discovery and scandal would not become an object of pity or scorn in the village or a source of shame to him when society turned its back. Because she had spent too many years being invisible to voluntarily become something worse, something whispered about in tones of judgment and dismissal. She told him that if he truly valued her, if their friendship meant to him even a fraction of what it had come to mean to her, then he must also respect the reality of their situations, the gulf that separated their stations and the consequences that would fall upon them both, but most heavily upon her, if they allowed themselves to cross lines that society had drawn with absolute clarity. William listened without interrupting, his gaze never leaving her face, and when she finished, he was silent for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his features and the snow falling steadily beyond the window, and then he leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly, as though acknowledging the truth of everything she had said. He told her she was right, that the world would object, that his family would be appalled, and society would condemn them, and the gossip would be vicious and unrelenting. And Eleanor felt something inside her begin to crumble because this was the confirmation she had expected, the acknowledgement that what lay between them could go no further. But then William leaned forward again, his eyes intense and his voice low and urgent, and he said that he had spent 5 years living according to duty and propriety and the expectations of his station, that he had done everything correctly and appropriately, and had been dead inside the entire time, moving through his days like a ghost in his own life, and that he could not return to that now that he had found something real. He asked her a question that made the room seem to tilt around her, asked if she could care for him, station and society aside, if there was any possibility that her heart might answer his, because he needed to know whether the barrier between them was only external or whether it was also a matter of her own feelings. Eleanor found she could not look away from him, could not summon the protective deflection she had relied upon for so many years, and she understood that this was the moment when she must choose between safety and truth, between the careful preservation of her dignity and the terrifying vulnerability of honest answer. Eleanor chose truth, chose the terrifying vulnerability of honesty over the cold safety of deflection, and she told William in a voice that trembled despite her efforts to steady it, that she had cared for him, silently and hopelessly from a distance for more years than she could comfortably admit, that she had watched him move through the halls of Ashworth Manor with a quiet devotion she had never dared to name even to herself, because to name it would have made the pain of invisibility unbearable. She said that she had known every expression that crossed his face, had learned to read his moods from the set of his shoulders or the way he held his pen when working late in his study, had memorized the sound of his voice and the particular cadence of his rare laughter, and that she had left not because she stopped caring, but because the weight of caring so much for someone who did not know she existed had become a burden she could no longer carry without losing herself entirely. She told him that his attention now, these visits and conversations, and the way he looked at her as though she were someone worth seeing, was both the fulfillment of every secret dream she had harbored, and a source of terror so profound it left her breathless, because she understood with painful clarity the cost he would pay if he continued down this path, the scandal and rejection and loss of standing that would follow any deeper connection between them. William listened with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged, and when she finished, he reached across the small space that separated them and took her hand in his, the first real touch they had shared, his fingers warm and solid around hers in a way that made her breath catch and her heart stutter with the simple enormity of it. He told her, his voice rough with emotion, that he would not live half a life again, that he had spent 5 years as a ghost, moving through days that held no meaning or joy, and that knowing her had given him back something essential he had believed lost forever, not just happiness, but the capacity for it, not just connection, but the desire for it. He said that he understood she was frightened, that he was frightened too, but that he had learned through grief and loss that the greatest tragedy was not the judgment of society, but the failure to reach for what mattered when it was offered, and that she mattered. She mattered more than propriety or convention or the narrow opinions of people who had never bothered to see her true worth. He asked her then, his grip on her hand tightening as though he feared she might vanish if he let go, to marry him, to be his wife and Sophia's mother, and his partner in building a life that honored what they had found together, rather than what the world insisted they should settle for, and Eleanor felt the room tilt around her as the question hung in the fire-lit air between them, impossible and terrifying and more real than anything she had ever been offered. Eleanor sat frozen in the fire-lit stillness of her cottage, the weight of William's proposal settling over her like snow accumulating on winter branches, beautiful and heavy and potentially breaking, and she found that her voice, when it finally came, was thin and unsteady. As she asked him if he truly understood what he was proposing, if he had genuinely considered the full measure of what such a marriage would mean. She told him with increasing urgency that there would be scandal, that society would reject them both, that his family would be appalled, and his mother would never forgive him, that every drawing room in the county would buzz with gossip and judgment, that invitations would cease and doors would close, and his standing among his peers would be damaged, perhaps beyond repair. She said that Sophia's prospects would be affected, that the daughter of a lord who married a servant would face whispers and exclusion, that other families of good standing might refuse to associate with her when she came of age, and Eleanor could not bear the thought of that bright, loving child suffering for the choices of adults who should have known better. She asked William if he had thought about the daily reality of it, the way servants who once bowed to him would smirk behind his back, the way his equals would pity or mock him, the way she herself would be scrutinized and criticized at every turn, her manners and speech and dress held up as evidence of her fundamental unsuitability. William listened to this torrent of fear and objection without releasing her hand, and when she finally fell silent, breathless and trembling, he told her with a calmness that somehow steadied her that he had considered all of it, every consequence she named, and others besides, that he had spent the last weeks lying awake at night, weighing his duty against his heart and confronting the costs with open eyes. He said that his daughter did not need social standing or fashionable connections, that Sophia needed a mother who was kind and present and real, not some society match of cold propriety who would treat her as an obligation rather than a joy, and that Eleanor had given his child more genuine maternal warmth in 10 years of invisible service than many fashionable ladies would offer in a lifetime of marriage. He said that he needed Eleanor, that he had been dead for 5 years and she had brought him back to life, and that he would rather face scandal with her than spend another decade of hollow respectability without her. He asked again, his voice low and urgent, if she would marry him, if she would trust him to know his own mind and heart. And Eleanor found herself trembling not just with fear now, but with something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. She told him, her voice barely above a whisper, that she needed time to think, that she could not make such a decision in the heat of the moment, with her hand in his and her heart racing so fast she could barely breathe. William nodded slowly, released her hand with visible reluctance, rose to leave, but before he reached the door he turned back and told her that whatever she decided, he would not regret having asked, would not regret having found the courage to reach for something real. He left then, stepping out into the winter night, and Eleanor sat alone in the sudden silence with his proposal hanging in the air like a promise or a threat, impossible and terrifying and more real than anything she had ever been offered. Eleanor spent 3 days in a state of suspended existence, moving through the small rooms of her cottage like a ghost haunting her own life, unable to settle to any task or thought beyond the weight of William's proposal and all it meant. She woke each morning with the question pressing on her chest like a physical thing, sat at her table with tea growing cold in her cup, while she turned the possibilities over in her mind with the obsessive thoroughness of someone examining a jewel for flaws or perhaps a trap for hidden mechanisms. She considered what it would mean to refuse him, the safety in that choice, the way she could preserve her modest independence and spare him the consequences of defying every social convention that governed his world. And she told herself that this would be the noble choice, the selfless one, protecting him from his own generous but ultimately ruinous impulse. But she also allowed herself, in the long watches of the night when honesty came easier, to imagine accepting, to picture herself as William's wife, standing beside him not as a servant, but as a partner, mothering Sophia not from the shadows but in full acknowledgement, building a life that honored what they had found together rather than what society insisted they should settle for. She thought of the costs he would pay, the scandal and rejection and closed doors, and she wondered if she had the right to let him make such a sacrifice, if love could ever be worth the price he would be asked to pay in reputation and standing and family approval. On the second day, Mrs. Pemberton came to visit, her kind face creased with concern, and Eleanor found herself confessing the proposal and her terrible indecision. And the housekeeper listened with the patience of long friendship before saying that Eleanor had spent 10 years making herself small and invisible for the comfort of others, and perhaps it was time to trust that she might be worth the trouble, worth the fight, worth the scandal. Eleanor wept then, surprising herself with the force of her emotion, and Mrs. Pemberton held her and told her that refusing William to protect him was just another form of disappearing, another way of deciding that her own worth was less important than avoiding difficulty. By the third day, Eleanor understood with a clarity that felt like sunlight breaking through winter clouds that she had a choice to make, not between selfishness and nobility, but between fear and courage, between hiding and being seen. And she realized that if William was brave enough to ask her, then she must be brave enough to accept, to trust his judgment of his own heart, and to believe in her own value as something real and worthy rather than something to be apologized for or hidden away. She sat at her small desk and wrote a brief note asking him to call on her, that she had an answer to his question, and when she handed it to the boy who would carry it to the manor, she felt terror and exhilaration in equal measure, the sense of standing on a precipice with no certainty of what lay beyond, but a fierce determination to leap anyway. William arrived at Eleanor's cottage within the hour of receiving her note. His horse lathered from the speed of his ride, and when Eleanor opened the door to him, she saw in his face such a mixture of hope and fear that her own anxiety quieted in the need to ease his, and she stepped back to let him enter, gestured him toward the chair by the fire, but he remained standing, his whole body tense with waiting. She had rehearsed what she would say, had planned a speech that would explain her reasoning and articulate her decision with the clarity it deserved. But when she opened her mouth, the careful words vanished, and what came out instead was simple and unadorned, just 3 words that nevertheless contained the whole of her courage and her choice. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." And for a moment William did not move, did not seem to breathe, as though he could not quite believe what he had heard. And then he crossed the small room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms with such force and relief that she gasped, and his embrace was not tentative or restrained, but fierce and encompassing, as though he had been holding himself back for months, and could finally let himself feel the full measure of what she meant to him. Eleanor found herself clinging to him with equal intensity, her face pressed against his chest, hearing the thunder of his heart beneath the fabric of his coat, and when he finally loosened his hold enough to look down at her, his eyes were bright with emotion that made him seem younger, more vulnerable, utterly transformed from the distant lord who had never noticed her. He framed her face with his hands, his touch gentle despite the strength in his fingers, and asked if she was certain, if she truly understood what she was choosing, and Eleanor told him that she was terrified and exhilarated, and more certain than she had been of anything in her life, that she had decided to trust him and to trust herself, to believe that what they had found was worth whatever challenges lay ahead. William kissed her then, a kiss that started soft and questioning, seeking permission even now, and when Eleanor responded, rising on her toes to meet him more fully, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and promise, and a future neither of them had dared to imagine just months before. When they finally drew apart, breathless and smiling, they sat together on the small settee and began to speak of practicalities with a giddiness that made even logistical details feel like adventure, agreeing that they would marry quickly and quietly, within a month if the banns could be read and arrangements made, because both of them feared that delay would only invite more opposition and doubt. William said he would speak to the vicar the next day, that he would make it clear this was not an impulsive folly, but a deliberate choice made by a man in full possession of his faculties and his heart, and Eleanor said she would face whatever society threw at them with her head high and her hand in his, because she had spent 10 years being invisible and would not shrink back into shadows now. The wedding took place on a January morning, when frost still clung to the windows of the village church, and the sky held that peculiar pale clarity that comes after days of snow, and Eleanor stood in the small vestibule in a gown of deep blue wool that Mrs. Pemberton had helped her alter from one of her aunt's better dresses, simple and elegant and utterly unlike the elaborate confections that ladies of William's circle would have worn, but it suited her, and when William saw her, his eyes told her that she was beautiful in a way no mirror ever had. The church was barely a quarter full, a scattering of witnesses to a union that most of society viewed as somewhere between scandalous and incomprehensible. But those who had come mattered more than the multitudes who had stayed away. Mrs. Pemberton sat in the front pew, weeping openly into her handkerchief. Several of the younger maids from the manor had come in their best dresses and watched with shining eyes, as though witnessing a fairy story made real, the vicar who had agreed to perform the ceremony. Despite raised eyebrows from his patron, stood ready at the altar with a kindness in his expression that suggested he saw something beyond station and propriety. And Sophia stood beside Eleanor in a white dress with ribbons in her hair, clutching a small posy of hothouse flowers and practically vibrating with excitement at her role as flower girl and the prospect of gaining the mother she had begged for. Lady Ashworth had sent a brief note the day before, 5 lines of cold formality that managed to acknowledge the wedding without offering congratulations or blessings, and while the absence of William's mother should have cast a shadow over the day, Eleanor found she could not summon resentment when she looked at the man waiting for her at the altar, tall and steady and looking at her as though she were the only person in the world worth seeing. The villagers who had come out of curiosity filled the back pews, whispering behind gloved hands, their faces showing everything from disapproval to fascination to something that might have been reluctant admiration for the sheer audacity of what was happening. Eleanor walked down the aisle without anyone to give her away, her chin high and her steps steady, and when she reached, William and saw the fierce joy and absolute certainty in his face, all her lingering fears quieted into a profound conviction that this was right, that they were right, that love was allowed to overturn hierarchies and rewrite the rules that said she should have remained invisible forever. They spoke their vows in clear voices that carried through the small church, promises of love and honor and partnership, that meant more for being chosen against every obstacle and expectation. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and William kissed her with a tenderness that made Mrs. Pemberton sob even harder, Eleanor felt the final walls of her old life fall away, and a new identity settle around her shoulders like a cloak, not just as Lady Ashworth, but as a woman fully seen and wholly loved. The wedding breakfast was held at Eleanor's cottage, a modest gathering that filled the small rooms with warmth and laughter that seemed to press against the very walls, and Mrs. Pemberton had insisted on preparing the food herself, arriving before dawn to lay out cold meats and fresh bread and a cake she had baked in the manor kitchens with a defiance that made the other servants whisper admiringly about her loyalty. William stood in the centre of the tiny parlour, looking almost comically large amid the simple furnishings. Yet there was nothing awkward in his manner, only a deep contentment that softened every line of his face as he accepted congratulations from the handful of guests and kept his wife close at his side with a protectiveness that was tender rather than possessive. Eleanor moved through her own cottage as though seeing it for the last time, touching the back of the chair where she had sat reading by candlelight, glancing at the window where she had watched the seasons change and wondered if she would grow old here alone, knowing that within the hour they would depart for Ashworth Manor, and this brief chapter of solitary independence would close, yet feeling no regret, because what she was gaining was so much greater than what she was leaving behind. Sophia had attached herself to Eleanor's skirts and refused to be separated, chattering endlessly about how she now had a mamma, and whether Eleanor would still tell her stories, and could they have tea parties in the nursery. And when Eleanor knelt down to assure the child that nothing would change, except that they would be together always, Sophia threw her arms around Eleanor's neck and whispered "Mamma" into her ear for the first time. The single word delivered with such trust and joy that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes and had to press her face against the child's hair to compose herself. William saw the moment, saw his wife and daughter embracing in a shaft of winter sunlight that streamed through the cottage window, and the rightness of what he had done settled into his bones with a certainty that no amount of social disapproval could shake, because this was what family was meant to be. Not cold duty and appropriate matches, but genuine love and mutual recognition, and the building of something real. When it was time to leave, William lifted Eleanor over the threshold of the cottage in a playful gesture that made her laugh and the gathered guests cheer, and then he handed her up into his carriage, the fine vehicle that would carry her not away from her life, but into it, Sophia scrambling in after them with her flower petals still clutched in her fist. As the carriage rolled toward Ashworth Manor, Eleanor sat between her husband and her daughter, one hand clasped in William's and the other resting on Sophia's bright head, and she understood, with a clarity that took her breath away, that she had finally become visible. Not because someone had deigned to notice her, but because she had claimed her own worth and found people capable of seeing it, and the future that stretched before her was not the modest independence she had planned, but something infinitely richer, a life of partnership and love and belonging that she had never dared to imagine could be hers. 2 springs had passed since the January morning when Eleanor Hartley became Lady Ashworth, and she stood now in the manor gardens on an April afternoon in 1820, with the scent of early roses drifting on the warm air and the sound of Sophia's laughter floating from somewhere near the orchard where the child was playing with the new puppy William had brought home last week, and Eleanor found herself pausing in her inspection of the flower beds to simply absorb the profound rightness of her life, a sensation so different from the resigned invisibility that had defined her existence for so many years, that sometimes she still had to touch the ring on her finger to believe it was real. The transformation had not been without difficulty. Those first months when society had buzzed with scandal and many doors had remained firmly closed, but Eleanor had moved through it all with the same quiet dignity that had always been her strength, and gradually her grace and genuine warmth had won over even the most reluctant members of William's circle, until now she was accepted, if not universally embraced. And more importantly, she had discovered that the opinions of people who valued station over character mattered far less than she had feared. The household ran smoothly under her management, but in a way fundamentally different from how it had operated under the previous Lady Ashworth, for Eleanor knew every servant by name and circumstance, inquired after their families, noticed when someone was unwell or troubled, and the staff repaid her attention with a loyalty and affection that made Ashworth Manor feel less like a great house and more like a home. William had become not just her husband, but her truest partner, and the love between them had only deepened as they built a life of genuine intimacy and mutual respect. his initial awakening to her worth having blossomed into a devotion that showed itself in 1,000 daily kindnesses and the way he still sometimes looked at her, as though marveling that he had nearly let her slip away unseen. Sophia thrived under Eleanor's mothering, the anxious child of 2 years ago, now confident and bright, secure in the knowledge that she was loved, and when she called Eleanor Mamma, it was with the unself-conscious certainty of a girl who had never known any other mother in her memory. Eleanor moved through the garden, touching the roses that were just beginning to bloom, and thought about the woman she had been, invisible and resigned, whispering goodbye to a life she had never truly been part of, and she understood now that her journey had required both the courage to leave and the courage to return, the strength to claim her own worth, and the wisdom to accept love when it finally saw her. If you are listening to this story and you feel unseen, if you have spent years being overlooked or dismissed, if you have resigned yourself to a smaller life than your heart desires, let Eleanor's transformation remind you that it is never too late for recognition, never too late for love, never too late to step into the fullness of who you were meant to be. The world may try to render you invisible, but your worth exists whether or not others have the eyes to see it. And somewhere there may be someone who will finally look at you and truly see, someone for whom you will not have to diminish or hide or apologize for taking up space. Hold on to your dignity, trust in your value, and know that the story of your life can change in a single moment when you find the courage to whisper goodbye to invisibility and step toward the light. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe for more tales of hope and unexpected joy, stories that remind us all that love can overturn even the most rigid hierarchies and that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to believe they deserve to be seen.